Hi, this is Morihiko Nakahara, and welcome to the final Masterworks concert of the 2022-23 concert season. And I'm here in the gallery space here at the Koger Center for the Arts, and here to talk about two pieces of music that comprise this final program, which is titled, the theme is Titans and Outlaws. And in the concert, you will hear the Outlaws first in the form of Aaron Copland's Billy the Kid suite. And for the Copland, we are also, this is a side-by-side performance with the our youth orchestra. So you will see probably up to like 150, I am guessing. Usually when we do the side-by-side with our youth orchestra, you will see like 150 of us taking up the entire stage of the Koger Center, and it's always great fun to collaborate with these talented young musicians of the youth orchestra, to have them play side by side, literally, with their counterparts in the South Carolina Philharmonic. In some instances, the person who they are sitting next to is also their teacher. Maybe they're studying privately, apply lessons with these musicians in the orchestra too. So it's a very special moment for both the students and the pros as well. So that will be a huge orchestra you'll see in the first half of the program. And in the second half, the Titans. So not the Tennessee Titans, different kind of Titans, but you will hear the Mahler's Symphony No. 1. Which he at some point and we'll kind of not go through in detail, but kind of touch on his struggle with this particular symphony, trying to find like the perfect identity and format for this piece. But at one point, Mahler referred to this symphony as Symphony No. 1, Titan. So that's where the Outlaws and Titans come from. For this concert, and it's quite fitting for the season finale of this Masterworks season to have these two pieces. Mahler symphonies are, like he himself described what a symphony should be. He said, symphony should, a symphony, as in a piece of music, a symphony should embrace everything. And he was remembered for his symphonies, the longest of which, not the one we're doing, but the longest of which lasts like almost 100 minutes. So these are like, the Lord of the Rings scale of symphonic works, if you would. So these like epic symphonies that Mahler was known for. And of course, in the first half, we have this Copland ballet score featuring a humongous, huge orchestra on stage. And of course, it's the first time we'll be able to we're able to do this side-by-side post-COVID. So it's been a few years since we did the side-by-side. We usually try to do this at least every other year on a Masterworks concert. And we just haven't been able to do that since in the last few years for obvious reasons and concerns. But now I'm glad to be able to showcase our youth orchestra on our Masterworks concert as well. So Aaron Copland, American composer, of course, and he's probably best remembered for these pieces that he wrote within the span of about 5 years, starting with Billy the Kid, which came in 1938, and then sort of, 5 to 7 years, let's say. So in 1945, he wrote the famous Symphony No. 3, also included the Fanfare for the Common Man. 1943 was the Appalachian Spring, another one of his most popular scores. And in between, also have the Rodale, which has the famous Hold Down, beef, that's what's for dinner reference there. So these sort of, and these are all pieces that really sort of defined him or established Copland as one of the most, quote, American composers. Somehow now his music is associated with when one thinks of the American West, for example. That's the case in Billy the Kid and also Rodeo as well. But he himself really never really spent that much time outside of, well, he spent some time in Paris, but in America, he was, he considered himself very much a product of Brooklyn. And it's almost kind of ironic that, he was very much like an urban guy, like the big city guy, and now by his music, seems to always kind of evoke this sense of open prairie or majestic mountains in various other parts of this nation. So that's kind of interesting, but that was sort of a shift when he started writing these works in the late 30s. It was kind of a definite, decidedly conscientiously planned shift artistically for him. If you listen to Copland's earlier works, dating from the 1920s, for instance, if you ever check out pieces like his piano concerto, for instance, and apparently when his piano concerto was first performed, I think in Boston, it was, people talk about sort of the riot that Stravinsky's Rite of Spring had caused, a few years before that. Apparently, it was one of those things, people were like throwing tomatoes, or I don't know if they had tomatoes. I don't know who go to concerts with tomatoes in their purses, but I mean, people were probably throwing things at the stage because they were, apparently they didn't like the piece as much as Copland had hoped. But if you listen to a lot of his earlier music, there's a definite jazz influence, but in a very much like angular, very rhythmic, very angular, and the rhythm is very irregular in a way. So it's very difficult, for instance, to like walk or dance to, or it's hard to like hum the melodies because the rhythm is so complicated in some of his earlier music. He also kind of dabbled in with atonal music a little bit, which was sort of the big trend at the time, especially in Europe at the time. So he was kind of chasing after the avant-garde trends in music. And that's sort of, he became known for those pieces at first. And then in the 30s, he actually wrote, publicly stated that he was starting to become sort of disillusioned by what he felt was sort of the gulf or separation between like people's enjoyment of music and the living composer, like himself. So he sort of made a conscientious decision at that time to really start incorporating new techniques, but in a way that was, I guess, more fun to listen to in some ways, or at least didn't offend the listeners or didn't shock or confuse the listeners as much as some of his earlier output had done. So that was sort of the shift, and Billy the Kid actually represents one of the first attempts by Copland to embody this and put it into practice musically. So that's sort of the aesthetic background really for the piece. He was commissioned to do this ballet by Lincoln Kirstein, who fashioned himself, or he wanted to be sort of Diaghilev in America. So he wanted to commission these great composers, American composers who were making the splash at that time, and hire the best people that he could think of to do the set design and costume design and so on, to create a new style of ballet that was decidedly American. And he had a group called American Ballet Caravan, and so that's who Copland wrote Billy the Kid for. He was reluctant to do this at first. Billy the Kid, or William Bonney, real life character, of course. And the perception was, of course, the idea was that Copland would quote some cowboy songs interspersed among his original materials to create this ballet. And he said, initially he said, well, there's only one problem. He said he did not like cowboy songs at all, and so he was not going to do this commission until somebody told. Then he did some research into Billy the Kid, William Bonney, and he said, oh, actually, Billy the Kid actually was raised in. He was originally from New York City. Then he thought, well, okay, I can do that. So apparently that was the only thing that convinced Copland to take on Billy the Kid, was the fact that Billy the Kid moved out west from New York City. But lucky for us, he decided to do this. So he was spending a lot of time, especially the summers, in Paris. This time. He also has spent some time in Mexico. He loved going down to Mexico, but he also enjoyed connecting with his European colleagues in Paris every summer. So he talked about how he literally took a book of cowboy songs to Paris. And so there he is, sitting in Paris cafe or wherever, and looking at cowboy songs to create and to orchestrate this ballet. One of the clever things about, well, there are few things of note in this music. One is in the quotations of about half a dozen, if not more, cowboy songs in the music. And as I mentioned, they're now interwoven with the original materials that he wrote, and so that's something that's notable. The other thing is that he wanted to create a color, like a timbre, color by combination of instruments. He wanted to create, instead of using an actual harmonica in the orchestra, he took it upon himself to create a harmonica-like sound or harmonica-like color in the orchestra. So he does this by combining some of the woodwinds, upper woodwinds, and muted trumpet. And combining these elements, he creates what sounds almost like a harmonica throughout some of the key moments in this piece. There are 6 sections, so there was a whole ballet, and he basically took about 2/3 of the musical materials from the ballet to create what you're going to hear on this program, which is the Billy the Kid suite. So it's sort of like the orchestral, the best of, in a way, sort of the musical highlights of the ballet itself. But really a big chunk of the ballet made it into this suite. So it's basically in 6 main sections, and it goes chronologically. So the first one is called the Open Prairie. So there he sets this very much, he evokes the landscape of the great Wild West, and starts out sort of the sunrise sort of thing, just very much still, and then the things start to develop, and the lights start to shine in on the stage. And then the next scene is called Street in a Frontier Town, and essentially becomes the sort of the cowboy song medley here. He quotes like three or four different cowboy songs in this particular scene, sort of again evoking recreating musically sort of the scene that you might have found in a typical frontier town at this time of this time in American history. Then the scene changes from the daytime to night, and this is the card game at night is the next scene, which leads into the infamous gun battle, where the percussion section and low brass they provide some heavy artillery for this battle. And then goes into the next section, which kind of skips the timeline a little bit, but this is a celebration after Billy's capture. So it's a very much rhythmic dance that happens. And then Billy's demise. And then in Billy's demise, at the end, he goes back to the opening scene to just kind of bookend the piece. Again, just kind of, it's like like a film technique almost, where you like at the end of or during the end credits, end titles, maybe like the camera shifts its focus from the human characters now back again to the natural setting of the open prairie. So it's sort of has that kind of format musically as well. He had one quirky quote about this. He was asked at one point. He said, "Mr. Copland, you quoted all these cowboy songs, cowboy tunes during in your Billy the Kid, but but you didn't use Home on the Range." And he basically quipped, "Well, I had to draw the line somewhere." So I guess that was his. He said no Home on the Range. That's like he would use some other cowboy tunes that he liked, but just did not want to use Home on the Range. So that's Billy the Kid in the first half. And after the intermission, we will perform for you the epic Symphony No. 1 by Gustav Mahler. Mahler actually worked for a time as a conductor in the US. So he was born in 1860, died in 1911. He died in Vienna, but shortly before his death, he had the distinction of holding down two major musical positions in New York City. Simultaneously, he was a music director at the Metropolitan Opera and the New York Philharmonic. And nobody has done that since him. But he was holding down those positions. But then he was also in charge of the opera in Vienna as well. So he was making some trips back and forth, which it was too much for his health. Eventually, he just went back to Vienna, and that's where he died in 1911. He during his lifetime, he was probably in some ways he was probably better recognized as a conductor than a composer. Even in Vienna, where he spent a lot of time, as a famous story is that the Vienna Philharmonic, one of the most historic and storied ensembles in the world, until Bernstein went there to play Mahler symphonies with the Vienna Philharmonic, like in the 60s or so, even the Vienna Philharmonic didn't play Mahler symphonies. They thought Mahler symphonies were a joke, and actually took American Leonard Bernstein to go there and really like bring out the creative invention and the dramatic scope of Mahler's music, even to the Viennese musicians. And now, decades later, Gustav Mahler's symphonies are sort of staple of many orchestras' seasons. They do require huge resources in terms of number of musicians that are required to play his works. Even in this very first symphony, usually when you see our concerts, you see the strings sort of occupying the front of the stage right in front of me. Then you would see in the middle of the stage, you would see the woodwinds. And typically, if it's something like a Tchaikovsky symphony, let's say, written not, comparatively still from the same half of the 19th century as the Mahler Symphony No. 1, but when you look at a Tchaikovsky symphony being performed, let's say we're doing it, and you look at the woodwind section, you'll probably see, 2 or 3 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, and 2 bassoons. He uses, in Mahler, in this symphony, he uses 4 flutes, and basically all of the woodwind sections are basically doubled from what you would normally see. You would often see either 4 horns, sort of over here in this corner of the Koger stage, you typically will see 4 horns or maybe 5. That's sort of a different technical thing. There are 4 parts, but the principal horn part is often so demanding and physically tiring that most orchestras like us, we actually hire an assistant for that person. So that's why you would often see 5 horns, but they're playing 4 parts. In Mahler Symphony No. 1, there's 7 horn parts. So on. So it's written for a huge orchestra, and as far as Mahler symphonies go, this isn't even the biggest orchestra. The next symphony, which is the second symphony of Mahler, which is known as the Resurrection Symphony, is even written for a bigger orchestra, off-stage brass, in addition to those people you see on stage, plus a chorus, and 2 vocal soloists. So it's double the number of people you will actually see for the first symphony. So he was known for these, Mahler was known for using a vast, huge-sized orchestra. But what's interesting about his writing is that he doesn't use all of them all the time. You know, when you have 90 people on stage, but then he creates such intimate, almost chamber music-like moments throughout his symphonies. So it's not necessarily it's loud and bombastic all the time. The end of the finale of the first movement is definitely very loud because everybody is playing full force. But earlier on the symphony, and the way the symphony opens even, it is just very soft, almost like a whisper. So he utilizes this vast canvas of instruments and sound that he has at his disposal in such a unique and effective way in his symphonies. And it's, you know, I think that's one of the appeals. If you talk to many of my colleagues who play in orchestras, like here with the South Carolina Philharmonic, but around the world, and you know, if you ask, well, whose music do you want to perform? A lot of times, you know, a lot of them, especially I guess brass players, would say Mahler, Gustav Mahler's music. So you know, that's sort of the appeal of his music. When he wrote this, he actually conducted the premiere of this. Incidentally, 9 days after Strauss conducted the premiere of his Don Juan, which was heard in the previous concert, Mahler conducted the premiere of this symphony, which wasn't called the symphony yet, but we'll get to that in a second. In Budapest, he was just starting to work as the head of the opera in Budapest of the Hungarian State Opera, and this was sort of one of his first experiences with this. Like so many pieces that are now sort of staples of orchestral repertoire, the first few performances did not go well for Mahler as far as the public reception and critical perception of the work are concerned. It was quite the opposite, actually. A lot of people pretty much hated it. So then Mahler decided, well, there's something wrong. He believed strongly in the piece itself, but he thought maybe he needed to tinker with it a little bit to make it either more approachable or more understandable to people. So he did this series of revisions and calling it different names. First, it wasn't even called a symphony, but it was more of a symphonic fantasy or a suite, similar to a symphony. Initially, it had an extra movement that he later dropped. So it was initially 5 movements instead of 4, as you will hear on this program. consider of 5 movements, which was split into two parts. Instead of movements, he called them 2 parts. So one was in the first 3 sections compose the first part, and then the last 2. Eventually, he decided he was going to drop what was originally the second movement. It now became a separate piece called Flower Chapter. And that's a very lyrical movement featuring a trumpet solo. And he decided to drop that to kind of make it into more traditional symphony as people expected in 4 movements. So that was one of the things he did. Another thing dealt with this whole notion of, is he telling a story in this music? And that's where the story of the subtitle or the title for this symphony, whether to use it or not, kind of comes in too. When it was first performed, it was not called Titan, and then it was not called Symphony either. At some point, he started calling it Titan, based on a novel he read at some point by John Paul, that kind of dealt with a hero, the Titan, is sort of in search of himself, in search of his identity, his past, pursuit of love, all of the typical heroic novel stuff. And he thought, well, maybe this will tell the story of my music better than something else. And then he changed his mind again, so he dropped that title. So I guess it's up to presenters and performers now whether to call this just simply Symphony Number 1 or Symphony Number 1, comma, Titan, quote unquote. So that's the question. Also, before some of the performances, Mahler would anonymously, it's a different time back then. So if there was an announcement of the performance of this particular symphony in a different town, Mahler would anonymously have published in that city's newspaper his commentary anonymously about the piece, in which in some instances he would go through a very detailed, what we would call program note, to say, sort of give a play-by-play, sort of in this, and then the oboe does this, and that depicts something else, and basically saying like what the music means. So he tried that, and he found that to be not as effective. So then he changed his mind, and then was quoted in another paper later on saying, well, actually, I believe that most of these programmatic depictions of musical intent doesn't quite work anyway, because people tend to perceive for themselves what they are listening to. We could play a same musical line, same melody, or same motif, and one person might take it to mean something completely different than the person sitting next to you. And in a way, that's the beauty of instrumental music. When there are no words, lyric, or text attached to it, that the meaning, quote unquote, of whatever we do on stage is up to you. And that's, I think that's, in some ways, that's the beauty of a lot of the orchestral music, is that we don't have to force feed you this is what this means, because maybe it wasn't intended to mean anything specific, or in any case, like I said, people perceive these things differently, and that's great. So Mahler kind of went around to that end of the spectrum on this, but in this symphony, I mean, there is sort of a narrative that runs through it, and part of that is because he quotes himself. By that I mean he recycles, or he uses some of the materials that he had already written. And in this case, he quotes some of the songs that he had written. There was a song cycle, set of songs called Songs of a Wayfarer, with the text that he wrote himself, because he could also write poetry as well. So he would set his own poems to music sometimes, and that's sort of what happened in some of these. So he actually quotes some of these songs of Wayfair. We could look into the text of the original songs to kind of get a meaning or get his intention of what's happening in this symphony as well. So goes through the 4 movements. We'll just kind of quickly go through these movements here. So in the first movement, he described the opening of this as he said, well, it's not really music. It's just the sound of nature. So there's this almost like a drone that kind of sets the stage. And maybe you will start to hear what sounds like, well, eventually cuckoo comes in. The cuckoo plays a big role, but you hear other birds. You will hear like maybe the wind or the leaves, all of these sort of the nature imagery that sets the stage. And this is whole sort of introduction to the main part of the first movement. So what he does, it's pretty genius. So he gives you like all of the ingredients almost before he presents you the entire recipe, right? So he kind of gives you all these musical fragments, little they're kind of dispersed all around the orchestra too. And sometimes it might sound a little bit random, but just all these fragments, eventually he's going to put all of these together to create what becomes the main theme, the melody of this first movement. And that'll actually reappear in the finale as well. So what is the main theme? The main theme, he actually quotes one of the songs that he had written for Songs of a Wayfair. And the text of this song talks about it's written from a perspective of a hero in a way, and he's walking in this lovely meadow, and he sees the beautiful meadows, hears the birds, sees the sunshine, and he thinks this is the great awakening of spring, in the nature, and he feels optimistic that, his life also is going to turn for the better. He's feeling optimistic about his outlook in his life. Maybe I'm going to find my true love, and I get a raise at my job, who knows? And then he realizes, though, then within the same poem, there's a realization that, even though the nature has its rebirth and renewal, new season and awakening, that's not going to happen to him as a person. So it's a bit of a downer. But the melody itself is pretty optimistic sounding. And that's what he develops through the first movement. It's almost, in a way, you can hear almost the very end of the first movement. It gets so frantic, almost to the point of almost like a musical mockery, in a way. And it's almost like there is an external commentator to the hero in the song to sort of mock his misfortune, in a way. You can kind of hear kind of musical laugh in this first movement. Second movement, whenever it was performed, even in places like Vienna, and then Viennese audiences apparently didn't really understand Mahler's music, when he was writing it. But they liked the second movement because the second movement probably sounded like the most traditional symphonic movement. And so it's more of a scherzo, but it has more of a definite, discernible dance, folk dance in this case, folk dance feel to it. And the format of it is very simple in a way too, because it's sort of ABA. There's dance one, which is more pompous and bold sounding, and dance two in the middle, which is more lyrical, intimate sounding, a little bit slower. and then goes back to dance one. It's a typical what we call ABA form, typical of forms like minuet or scherzo that you would often find in these symphonies by composers like Beethoven and so on. So they were very much used to that. And again, this is a fun one where the seven horns now are heavily featured in this movement. What puzzled a lot of people came next in the form of the third movement. And then third movement, again, opens in a kind of a mysterious way. And the solo bass plays a version of what is the nursery rhyme song that in English is Are You Sleeping? Or Brother Jack. But he plays it in minor instead of major key. He plays the minor version of it and a solo bass. So unlike solo violin, it has a totally different color, and it's also it is also very soft. So it's kind of, so people are wondering, people attending these concerts initially, they're wondering, what, this sounds like the tune we know, but then it doesn't sound right because it's in minor instead of major. Why is the bass playing the solo? Where is this going? So it confused a lot of people. So what happened was Mahler was inspired by few things. Apparently, he even later, when he was kind of getting rid of all these external programs, references, he did hung on to one thing, which was a painting he saw that depicted sort of this mock funeral of the hunter. And you see the hunter, and it's like a caricature, and all these animals are doing a mock funeral for the deceased hunter. So it's kind of macabre quality to it. And he said that image did influence this him writing this movement. So there's a funeral procession, but it doesn't stay somber. All of a sudden, there's a marching band that comes to kind of crash the proceedings. All of a sudden, it sounds like there's a klezmer dance or something going on in the middle too. And then eventually goes back to the funeral march like it started. And so that kind of confused a lot of people. It had both the very somber quality, kind of the grotesque, gross quality, the sarcasm, all of these things that are, part of our daily lives. And in some ways, concertgoer back then maybe didn't want to see that. They expected to see something that's more stylized or idealized in a lot of composers' works. And to them, this movement by Mahler was maybe too close, like too real, too much, and that was, that could be part of the reason that kind of confused a lot of listeners. But that's the third movement. It is a fun one, it's a fun one to do because it just goes through a lot of feels to do this one, and then the last movement, which kind of opens with this huge crash. So if you fall asleep at the end of the third movement, you'll be awake at the beginning of the fourth movement because it's like a loud clash, But that's the fourth movement is by far the longest of the four movements. It does refers back to the materials that you have already heard in the first movement of the symphony. There's one glorious moment towards the very end of this finale where, and not a lot of composers do this, but Mahler does, he actually has all the horns to stand and play. So all of a sudden we'll get into the finale, to the climax, and you will see the horn section just stand and play their big heroic theme. So it's a very theatrical, theatrical effect in this finale. And again, throughout the symphony, I mentioned the vast size of the orchestra, but they're not necessarily used, all of them are used simultaneously, necessarily. But in the finale, he shows, he gives us sort of the full throttle, like this is what 90 people on stage, playing full volume, the kind of the sonic spectacular that can create towards the end of this. That's the Mahler Symphony Number 1. It's we did this symphony, I think, for the last season finale of my first season. So probably, so it was like May of 2009 or something like that. So 14 years previous to this performance of it. And so I'm just thrilled to be able to revisit this piece. There, a lot of the musicians are same, but from 14 years ago. But we also do have quite a few new people in the orchestra too. So it's always kind of fun to revisit some of the works that we've done throughout my tenure here, and kind of build on all the years that we've spent together here, and to share that with you. So we're looking forward to it, and hope you enjoy this very spectacular season finale, the Outlaws, Titans and the Outlaws. Join us.